I watched the Apple event announcing the iPhone 14 yesterday, so today, while it's still fresh in my brain, let's break down the top most compelling new features of the iPhone 14, 14 Plus, 14 Pro, and Pro Max. There's not a ton of big new features, which leads me to a conclusion about all flagship phones I'll share with you toward the end of the video, but now that we know what we've been waiting for these past couple months, let's talk about the upgrades Apple made to this generation of iPhones. In order of importance, there's first the pill-shaped cutout on the 14 Pro and Pro Max that gives us the Dynamic Island. The Dynamic Island is essentially a glorified notification system that springs to life through animation out of the new camera cutout. These cutouts are nothing new, and they're really not objectively better than a notch, but what I will give Apple credit for here is the integration of this cutout into the software. I think it looks cool when it springs to life, it appears to carry a lot of functionality, but let's be honest with one another, one of the main purposes of this cutout is to give this new generation a different look than the previous models. Still, it's a 30% smaller footprint than the previous notch, and the software is elegant, so I say it's an improvement. Next, the new cameras on all iPhone 14 models are actually pretty interesting. I must say, Apple talked about that new 48 megapixel camera on the Pro and Pro Max pretty poorly during the event. They talked about cropping in to get an equivalent 2x zoom, but referred to it as if it was a different camera. But let me give you the rundown here clearly for all models. On the Pro and Pro Max, there's that 48 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 12 megapixel 3x telephoto. On the 14 and 14 Plus, there's a 12 megapixel main camera and a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera. And finally, on all four iPhone models, there's a 12 megapixel selfie camera with autofocus and a larger aperture. And in the field of computational photography, Apple touted that all their cameras are made even better than their specs would imply because of processing with their chips. And there's also a lot of camera-adjacent software upgrades that are kind of hard to keep track of, so let me do my best to break those down now. There's Action Mode, which allows advanced image stabilization for very shaky video on all iPhones released. There's up to 4K recording with Cinematic Mode, which is essentially portrait mode for video, across the entire iPhone lineup. And lastly, for only the Pro models, there's support for shooting in ProRAW all the way up to 48 megapixels. Overall, the iPhone 14s and 14 Pros got appreciable upgrades to already best-in-class cameras. Next on the chopping block, there's the brand new A16 Bionic chip for the Pro and Pro Max, and the year-old A15 Bionic chip for the regular 14 and 14 Plus. Now, we're in a time where all flagships are fast, and stay fast for a very long time. So while this lessens the effect of having a year-old chip in the iPhone 14s, it also diminishes the effect of the new chip in the 14 Pros. I like to bring reality checks to all my coverage of products, like in my M1 iPad Air review, talking about unusable power. So here, I'll give it to Apple that this new chip seems crazy fast, and the A15 Bionic is still excellent, but all flagship phones released this year will also be snappy and smooth. Next, let's jump into displays. All iPhone 14 screens across the board will use OLED technology, have a good resolution, and be bright and colorful. While the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus models didn't really get upgrades from the iPhone 13, the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max got bumped to a crazy 2000 nits peak brightness outdoors. Another screen-centered Pro-only feature is Always On Display, which dims the screen and displays important information persistently. And in the good old category of features you'd hope you'd never have to use, there's crash detection for automatically contacting emergency services in a car crash, and emergency SOS via satellite for getting a hold of emergency services when there's no cellular service or Wi-Fi. Those last two are across all iPhones released, and I personally put them in the category of, okay, that's pretty cool and I'd appreciate it, but I'm definitely not going to go out of my way to upgrade and get that feature. Alright, those are the most compelling new features of the iPhone 14, 14 Plus, Pro, and Pro Max. As for my own thoughts, I think flagship phones are leveling off for now, in a way similar to budget phones are in the video I made talking about those. In the 45 minutes of the Apple event dedicated to iPhones, Apple touted a lot of features that are already in iPhones to varying extents. So when it comes to the much smaller list of added features and whether they're compelling enough to get the newest model, I'd personally say hold off. As for me though, the only iPhone I've ever owned is the iPhone 8, and I kinda wanna buy the iPhone 14 to experience what I think is the end of an era. Similar to the iPhone 8 and Galaxy S7 and how those were the end of the era of home buttons and significant bezels on the front of phones, I think this is the end of flat slab phones with edge-to-edge displays on one side. I don't particularly know what's next, but I do kind of want to get my hands on the 14 to review it and talk about it in the context of my thoughts on the entire flagship scene. But with that being said, let me know what you think about that and the iPhone 14 in general, and whether I should pick it up and make a review video on it. Subscribe if you like this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.